No one could have predicted the turn that the seemingly routine press conference would take. The corridors of the White House were filled with the usual sounds of hurried footsteps and the half-whispers of advisors and secretaries, drowning in the dim light of the lamps. There was a slight tension in the air. The journalists gathered in the briefing room knew that President Donald Trump could be unpredictable, and his manner of answering questions often generated a storm of discussion and heated debate. But today, something about the routine was different, as if a spark was smoldering beneath the surface of the routine topics, ready to burst into an uncontrollable flame. Everyone in the room was bracing themselves for the standard questions about the economy and international politics, since there had been no sensational occasion in recent weeks. The president was expected to talk about successes on the diplomatic front, mention new legislative initiatives, and perhaps once again touch on the topic of homeland security, a favorite of all American media. Fun. There were a few minutes left before the start, and the correspondents who had received invitations gradually took their places, set up their cameras, and checked their microphones. The quiet clinking of coffee cups was heard in the hall, mixed with the hum of muffled conversations. Food. The main stage for another political show was ready. Julian Harris, a journalist known in the trade for hunting for facts like a lion hunting an antelope in a drought, had a front row seat. Over months of painstaking research, he had built up a fascinating theory that several large foreign corporations with close ties to foreign governments had secretly entered into agreements with Trump's business empire. During the presidency, Harris believed these connections had created conflicts of interest and, possibly, financial gain for both sides, distorting the perception of the integrity of power. Julian had circumstantial evidence and insider testimony, but for the story to break nationally, he needed the president himself to give straight answers. Today, he was about to ask the toughest question of his journalistic career. The room grew quiet as the briefing minutes ticked away. The press secretary came on stage, a graceful woman with a determined look and perfect posture, who addressed the audience briefly. The president will be arriving in a few minutes. Please take your seats and quietly prepare for questions. Her voice was impeccably polite, but there was a clear thread of strict control in it. It was extremely important for the president's team to keep the conference within strict limits, especially if someone among the reporters had wormed his way into the usual scenario of chaos. Finally, Donald Trump entered the room. He moved with his usual confidence, casually adjusting his tie and quickly scanning the audience. Camera flashes illuminated his figure with blinding flashes, and a short echo of greeting sounded in the speakers of microphones. The president began with an introduction, listing the successes of his administration: reduced unemployment, economic growth, new jobs. Everything looked familiar and even slightly soporific for seasoned correspondents. Trump spoke confidently, sometimes inserting jokes and barbs at political opponents, causing muffled laughter from part of the audience. It seemed like nothing was going to happen. But Julian Harris felt his pulse quicken. He glanced nervously at his notebook, where he had written down the bullet points of the questions, and recalled how much effort it had cost him to extract every detail from this story. Interrogations in the corridors of Congress, non-public meetings with informants, leaks of documents from the office of one of the offshore companies. This whole puzzle had been coming together for a long time, and now it was time to show it to the whole world. The conference went on as usual. Trump answered the usual questions about the budget, about international trade, about relations with allies in Europe and Asia. And then Harris raised his hand. The other reporters cast slightly surprised glances at him. Julian usually took his time with questions, preferring to listen, collect facts, and attack at the most unexpected moment. Now he decided to go for broke. The president himself noticed his movement and slightly raised an eyebrow. He knew that Harris was not the kind of journalist who asked banal questions, but he did not yet know what exactly he intended to ask. Mr. President, Julian began, trying to speak clearly and calmly, although his heart was pounding like a drum. Can you comment right now on the existence of secret financial transactions between your companies and foreign corporations connected to foreign governments? According to my information, these transactions took place during the period when you were already president. What can you say about this? At these words, the room noticeably tensed up. Someone even stopped typing on their laptop. One of the TV cameras shook and lost focus for a split second. Some reporters turned to Harris in bewilderment. Where did he get this information? Others, on the contrary, froze in anticipation of a loud scandal. The press secretary, standing to the side, went cold, bit her lip, and seemed ready to immediately intervene, but the president held her back with a gesture. Trump paused briefly, looking at Harris as if trying to gauge his resolve and seriousness. Then he responded with surprising calm. That's a very serious statement. His voice was a little lower than usual. Do you have any specific evidence, Mr. Harris? For the entire country, the question became a provocative test. If Harris couldn't come up with anything substantive now, he risked his reputation, and Trump could easily portray him as a fantasist or a provocateur. But Julian responded quickly, not allowing the president to seize the initiative. The supporting documents have been submitted to the Ministry of Justice. The fact is that no official steps have been seen on this matter for a long time. Don't you think that this may look like a deliberate hushing up? With these words, Harris effectively accused the presidential administration of trying to hush up an inconvenient truth. The reporters stirred again, and an almost physical interest flared up in the room. It became absolutely clear that the briefing had ceased to be routine, and a real scandal was possible, and perhaps something more. Trump's face darkened slightly, and he responded more harshly. I am not aware of any secret deals. All my companies operate within the law, and after I took office, they were transferred to a trust, and I have no direct connection with their current operations. If you have concrete evidence, you, as a responsible citizen, should pass it on to the investigative authorities. Why do you think they are not conducting an investigation? Maybe because there is no reason, or do you have no real facts, only rumors and guesses? Despite the harsh tone, the president was smiling, and in that smile one could sense a desire to put an end to the conflict. But Harris was not about to give in. The facts will be made public soon, he replied, aware that he could not yet reveal the source of the documents, lest he endanger his informants. I am just wondering why neither the prosecutor's office nor the Ministry of Justice are responding to the transfer of information. Why is everything so quiet? No one in the room was hiding their curiosity. It was more like a staged scene from a political thriller than a regular briefing. It seemed like every reporter forgot about their prepared questions for a second. Attention was focused on the duel between Harris and Trump. If you think your material is so sensational, Trump concluded, make it public. In the meantime, you are making unsubstantiated accusations, and I get the impression that the purpose of your speech is simply to attract attention to yourself. As president, I declare no law was broken, and I have no reason to fear your publicity. It seemed that the conversation could have ended there. However, the atmosphere became tense. Harris held himself confidently, although inside he was filled with anxiety. He understood that the president was skillfully deflecting the question and trying to switch the focus to Harris's motivation. At the same time, Julian felt that this exchange of remarks had already been caught on camera and would fly across news channels, social networks, and newspaper headlines. He had achieved his goal now. The public would not be able to ignore the topic. But the main thing was something else: to be able to maintain trust in himself and show that he was not looking for cheap fame, but was truly fighting for the truth. The press secretary, wanting to change the course of the press conference, motions to the operator, who announced the next question. The buzz returned to the room. Someone was hastily typing tweets. Someone was dialing the editor and retelling the sensational news. someone was already quietly planning an analytical article about the confrontation between the journalist and the president. However, the main events were just beginning. Harris felt that he was getting involved in something much more dangerous than a public spat with the authorities. He was about to encounter a force that could ruin his career and perhaps his entire future. In the corridors of the White House, when the briefing ended and the reporters began to leave the room, Harris was intercepted by one of the press secretary's assistants. The girl with a strict hairstyle but a friendly look asked Julian to come to a separate room to discuss the details. She did not say anything specific, only hinted that additional information on his question had arrived. Intrigued but wary, the journalist agreed, and within a couple of minutes he found himself behind the door of a small conference room, where there was only a table, a few chairs, and the dim light of a desk lamp, creating an intimate atmosphere. There, a man in an elegant suit and an expressionless face that rarely caught his eye was waiting for him. Harris immediately realized that he was an official who occupied some special position, perhaps one of the gray eminences in the presidential apparatus. The man introduced himself as Mr. Devlin, said that he was responsible for the administration's interaction with external contacts. Then, without preamble, he began to speak. I know that you are collecting information about the president's financial ties with foreign companies. Let me give you some advice. Be careful. Some things can be misinterpreted, and you can suffer not because of your fault, but because of political manipulation. His voice was calm, even politely warning, but there was a hint of threat in it. Harris narrowed his eyes, trying to remain calm. If you want to assure me that all the documents are fake, and that I have no reason to make a fuss, you are wasting your time. I am a journalist. My job is to ask uncomfortable questions and reveal the truth. Mr. Devlin nodded slightly, as if expecting such an answer. I understand. But you have your weak points too, Mr. Harris. Your editors, your sponsors, your informants. You don't want anyone to suffer because of an error or an incorrect presentation of the facts. It sounded like a direct hint that the revelations might provoke retaliation. Harris felt his stomach clench. He was being threatened softly, veiledly, but he was being threatened. And this was only the beginning of a big game. He knew he was on the brink of events that could not only shake the entire country, but also lead to real upheaval in his personal life. After a pause, Mr. Devlin continued. The president openly stated that he is ready for any checks. But if your materials are not confirmed, do you understand what consequences this will entail for your career and trust in the press? What you stated today has already become public knowledge, and this wave will only grow further. I can assume that you will face very close attention from special structures, and not only in our country. Julian held his gaze on the man's face and made a decision in his mind. Bluff that he had more facts or keep quiet. Finally, he said, "You will convey to the president that I will not back down. The truth is more valuable than any threats." Devlin leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and signaled that the conversation was over. As Harris left the room, he realized that he had crossed the line and could not turn back. The issue of high-level financial fraud had moved beyond investigative reporting into the realm of political gamesmanship and possible blackmail. And the stakes were high. Returning to the editorial office, he looked out the car window and thought about how quickly a person's fate changes when he takes on a scandal that is too big. Once, when he was still an intern at one of the provincial newspapers, he dreamed of making a report that would shake the country. Foya saying. And now it seemed he had such a chance. But everything in this world has to be paid for. Perhaps he would face persecution, pressure on his loved ones, slander from competitors. Or maybe no one would openly persecute him, but they would secretly begin to eliminate witnesses, break chains of evidence, and undermine his reputation from within. But his sense of professional duty and his desire to get to the truth outweighed his fear. After all, if all this was confirmed, if there really was a secret network of deals that undermined the integrity of the state, then the public needed to know about it. And he Julian Harris would be the one to expose the injustice and force them to face the truth, even if it meant sacrificing his own safety. That night, locked in his apartment, he sat over a pile of notes, reviewing papers with notes on transactions, recalling casual remarks from informants. There was no doubt the chain of monetary gain pointed to the top of the government. And although there was no direct evidence linking Trump personally to these actions, everything pointed to the president possibly knowing about, or at least being unknowingly involved in, the schemes being constructed by his confidants. Harris wrote on his laptop, "The main thing is to find evidence linking these transactions directly to the president. Without that, no one will believe the scale of the conspiracy." Night had fallen outside. Skyscraper lights were blinking in the distance, and behind the scenes, life was still in full swing in the Capitol. This story was just beginning, and Harris felt that there could be a new plot twist around every corner. He imagined the faces of the people who would be commenting on his question at a press conference the following day. Trump's political opponents, the president's supporters, lawyers, bloggers, analysts, they all pounced on this topic like vultures on prey. But only a few knew how serious the forces were behind what was happening. And only a few realized that in the shadow of major deals, secret levers of influence on the entire political system of the state are often hidden. Sleep was elusive, and the sense that he was on the brink of major revelations was both terrifying and exhilarating. Harris set a goal. The next morning, he would set up a meeting with a key source who had previously worked at one of the banks rumored to have handled the suspicious transactions. Without that confirmation, publishing the material would be too risky. He could already feel the pressure mounting, but there was no turning back. As the first rays of dawn appeared, the journalist's forehead became damp with emotion, but determination burned inside him. The conference had provoked a storm, and his goal was to figure out where the real truth was hidden. Transparency of power, or deeply veiled corruption, he had only just begun to unravel this tangle. But there was no turning back. Behind the doors of government offices, on the surface and in the shadows, there were people for whom power was more important than reputation, and money was stronger than ethics. And he had to face this world, During the day, the same thing happened again. News feeds exploded with headlines about how a journalist from an ordinary newspaper dared to challenge the president himself. The 24-hour news channels played the fragment of the press conference over and over again. Harris's questions, Trump's restrained but sharp answers, the tense faces in the room. Political scientists invited to the studio for the discussion disagreed. Some insisted that there was no evidence and that Harris was only trying to catch the hype on the president's name. Others claimed that even a shadow of doubt about the honesty of the head of state requires an immediate investigation. Harris, watching these reports, knew that he had been touched on the raw, verbal abuse from various experts, ill-wishers on social media, but his convictions were not shaken. He believed that he had important information, and the public had a right to know the truth. Now his task was to strengthen his position by finding more compelling evidence, and at the same time, not to allow himself to be destroyed in the information field. That same night, when the publication where Harris worked was preparing for the release of the morning issue, the reporter headed to the agreed place, a small bar in the suburbs of Washington. The meeting was scheduled for a late hour. The bar, Old Whiskey, has long earned a reputation for itself as a quiet refuge for those who do not want to be seen in the noisy clubs of the Capitol. Subdued lighting, worn leather sofas, a bartender who stood behind the counter and silently wiped glasses. Everything breathed anonymity and almost home comfort. It was here that Harris agreed to meet with a man who agreed to shed light on a chain of financial transactions that the whole city was now talking about. The man gave his pseudonym, Alex. He was short, had a neat beard, and his eyes darted from side to side, betraying his tension. When Harris approached him, Alex moved away slightly, as if afraid of being followed. But the journalist tried to reassure him. They were sitting in a far corner, and it was unlikely that anyone from outside would look in there. However, one could only trust him on his word. "So," Alex began, his voice low and barely audible over the rhythmic music, "you said on the phone that you wanted to find a direct link between the transactions and the president. I'll tell you right away, I haven't seen any document where Trump personally signs off on questionable payments." But there is something interesting. He took the flash drive out of his pocket and put it on the table. Harris looked at it, feeling mixed emotions, from delight to fear. How many times had he seen such media with important information that turned out to be nonsense? But his instinct told him that right now, he was on the right track. "It contains scans of the bank's internal documents," Alex continued. "We service a chain of affiliated companies, all of which are connected to Trump's former business. Companies registered in offshore zones receive transfers from structures connected to foreign individuals. These could be companies from Asia, the Middle East, Europe. The geography is broad. In these documents, you can see the nature of the payments, the amounts, and the recipients." But how do they implicate the president himself?" Harris interrupted. "He can say that all this is being done without his knowledge, because the companies are being managed by trusts and others." Alex raised his eyebrows. "That's why I said there is no evidence of direct involvement. But look deeper. There are repeated names, people from the president's inner circle who appear as trusted persons in these firms. These people regularly visit the White House, negotiate on behalf of the president. If you compare the data on visits and transactions, you will see patterns. A payment goes through. The next day, this person is noted in the visitor logs. And what decisions does the administration make during this period? Perhaps benefits are provided to foreign partners, or perhaps certain laws are being promoted. I don't know the details, but the connections are obvious." Harris knew he would have to do a lot of work to check and analyze all of this. But if it turned out to be true, it would be a powerful story that could blow up the political world. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, looking Alex straight in the eyes. "You understand the danger you're in, right?" He sighed and twirled the glass of whiskey in his hands. "I know, but I see where this corruption leads, and I don't want to be an accomplice. No amount of money is worth silently watching politicians trade in the interests of the country. And the president himself can hardly be so indifferent to this. If it comes to that, I'm afraid of the impunity of those who do all this." Harris nodded, accepting the flash drive and mentally promising himself that he would not remain in debt to this source. However, he had no idea how dangerous this step would be. By taking the drive with secret documents in his hands, he was condemning himself to the role of a target. And if before he had only been hinted at the consequences, now he could become the target of much more serious forces. The next morning, the editorial office was in an uproar. The editor-in-chief called Harris and demanded to explain why such a fire was flaring up around the journalist's name, and whether it threatened the reputation of the publishing house itself. Harris, clenching his teeth, told about his meeting and the documents that he had not yet had time to look through to the end. He understood that the editor would be cautious. The big bosses do not want to interfere in a political scandal if they are not sure that the story is worth it. "Well, look, Julian," said the boss, wearily rubbing the bridge of his nose, "I can't rush into the breach without evidence. If what you're saying is confirmed, it will be a bomb. But if it turns out that all this is far-fetched and guesswork, not only will we lose our reputation, but we could run into lawsuits. And Trump and his team will make mincemeat out of us. Do you have any guarantees that the information is cast iron?" Harris shrugged. "There are never any guarantees." But I have enough leads to continue. I ask only one thing. Give me time and the opportunity to dig deeper. If necessary, I will work in the field, go to meetings. I need the resource to verify everything." The editor paused, studying Harris's face, which showed unbending determination. "Yep." Finally, he nodded. "Okay. But remember, you take full responsibility. If everything goes wrong, we'll abandon this story." and then nothing will save you. Choose your words carefully in your articles until you have watertight evidence. A strange combination of relief and anxiety flared inside Harris. He had the green light, but he knew he was now teetering on the edge of an abyss. One mistake and he would be the victim. While the editorial board was talking, the wave of interest in the issue of financial fraud did not subside. Even at the official level, demands for an open investigation began to be heard, although White House representatives denied the possibility of any interference by the president. Activists began collecting petitions, opposition politicians gave interviews about the total corruption, and Trump supporters, on the contrary, accused the press of propaganda and an attempt to undermine confidence in the legitimately elected leader. The country split into two camps, each side vigorously supporting either the president or the journalist. In this atmosphere, Harris immersed himself in studying the data from the flash drive. He was assisted by several colleagues he trusted. It was like reading a mysterious scroll. Many lines, numbers, company names, dates, names. The deeper they dug, the clearer the picture became. Transfer schemes in favor of certain offshore structures arose regularly, coinciding with the signing of important international treaties, or with visits by foreign delegations, or with the receipt of large government contracts by certain companies. ANCAs. Threads led to people from the president's entourage who could officially act on behalf of Trump's organizations, but Trump himself was only indirect. His name appeared in emails in which employees discussed the need to clear details with the boss, or listed entourage #1 in a column that apparently coded senior management, but that indirectness could be enough to cause a stir. If journalists can prove a connection between business transactions and policy decisions, even without the president's direct signature, it would still be a scandal of historic proportions. While Harris's team was studying the documents, mysterious events were happening all around. One of the sources from the Justice Department suddenly disappeared from the radar, stopped answering calls and emails. A secretary at the department said that he had taken a vacation and gone abroad for an indefinite period. An informant from a commercial bank through which payments were made suddenly quit and also disappeared, passing on through acquaintances that he feared for his safety. An anonymous caller called the editorial office, claiming that urgent audits were being carried out in the offices of related companies and that documents were being destroyed. It seemed that some powerful forces had begun to clear the field, covering their tracks. And Harris had almost no time left to complete the investigation. The next step was to meet the man who figured in most of the transactions, Howard Wilkes, who was officially listed as an investment advisor to a company affiliated with Trump's old businesses. It was his signature on the informal agreements, and his frequent visits to the White House were recorded in the reception log. Any information he could provide could be crucial. Harris discovered that Wilkes lived in a fashionable neighborhood near downtown Washington. It was a quiet street surrounded by trees where people with money and connections lived. The reporter ambushed him as he was getting into his car outside his home. They managed to exchange a few words for a brief moment. "Mr. Wilkes," Harris said, trying not to scare the man with harsh words, "I need to talk to you about your business contacts. Do you think offshore transactions involving foreign corporations may be illegal?" Wilkes looked at the journalist with wide eyes. For a moment it seemed that he would get scared and leave immediately, but the journalist only sighed heavily and, giving an icy look, said through gritted teeth, "If you show up here again, I will contact the police." It was a cold wall of silence, but there was a hint of worry in his gaze, not just anger. Harris left with the strong feeling that Wilkes was hiding something. Perhaps he was too deeply involved in the scheme and was afraid of the backlash. Or perhaps he had already received strict orders from the administration to remain silent. In any case, the door to an important source of information remained closed. The walk back to the newsroom was accompanied by the roar of his own thoughts. Harris understood that even if he presented the bank papers and the logic of the connections to the public, the president and his lawyers would most likely deny everything. They would accuse the journalists of fabrication, and the courts would demand direct evidence of guilt. And if the process dragged on, public attention could fade, and the whole story would end inconclusively. It was difficult to fight against the power of the presidential administration and its allies. At the same time, events continued to unfold rapidly. Hashtags in support of Harris and his investigation were gaining momentum on social media, and there were even demonstrations outside the White House, calling for a revealing the truths and a stopping corruption. People shouted slogans and held signs with cartoons of Trump as a puppeteer, playing with puppets on stage that symbolized lobbyists and officials. On the other hand, the president's supporters called it all a witch hunt and a dirty innuendo. Ooh. Protests and counter-protests clashed in the streets, and police had to be on standby to prevent unrest. In this atmosphere of heightened passions, Julian remained the center of attention, a living symbol of the conflict between the free press and the apolitical elite. But his life became more complicated. Unknown people called at night, and the receiver was silent, interrupted by short warnings. One day, he left his apartment and found a note on his windshield with the words, "You keep quiet, live longer." He felt the fear creeping under his skin, but he had to remain calm for the sake of the cause. One evening, as he was about to leave the editorial office, a strange email arrived. The sender's address looked like a bunch of random characters, and the subject line contained only one word. Inside the email was a link and a short phrase. "You may be interested in this before it's too late." Harris usually treated such things as spam or provocation, but this time he decided to check. Using a secure computer, he opened the link in anonymous browser mode. In front of him was a page containing some photographs of correspondence between people whose names were directly associated with Trump. And these emails mentioned the need to settle issues with certain business partners in exchange for political concessions. So skepticism gave way to cautious interest. If the materials were genuine, they might be the link he needed. But the big question remained. Where did the leak come from? And was it a hoax designed to discredit the president, or conversely, to frame Harris himself? The journalist decided he needed a professional analysis of the files. He contacted technicians willing to check the metadata of the images and see if they had been tampered with. He agreed to meet them at an unofficial office they used for special investigations. It was a small loft with a reliable alarm and soundproofing, since they often worked with sensitive data. When experts examined the photos, they came to a preliminary conclusion. There were no signs of crude forgery, although a final conclusion would require a more detailed analysis. Harris felt a new surge of adrenaline. The picture was emerging. Bank transactions, negotiations through offshore companies, letters about political concessions in exchange for financial support. If all these documents turn out to be genuine, then the off-scale influence of money on Trump's politics becomes irreversibly obvious. Of course, all of this still needed to be checked and rechecked. But the feeling of being close to the big truth was inspiring and frightening at the same time. Julian understood that the administration might already know about his findings or guess. It was possible that in the coming days, they would launch a repressive apparatus against him that would expose him as either a traitor or a liar. But there was no turning back. He had crossed the Rubicon, after which a journalist ceases to be just an observer, but becomes one of the actors in a large-scale political game. After a tense evening at the loft, he returned home, exhausted but collected. It was well past midnight when he received a call on his mobile from an unknown number. This time, the voice was female, serene but determined. The woman said she was representing the parties involved and wanted to discuss the situation. Harris was suspiciously wary, but then the woman suddenly said something that immediately caught his attention. "I know you met with a man named Alex. I also know you received documents with unconfirmed transaction. If you want to hear the real truth about how things are, come to the old wing of the Library of Congress tomorrow at 3 o'clock. Come alone." Harris tried to ask questions, but the other end of the line hung up. He was left confused. Who was this woman? Was she threatening or helping? Could they be people looking to ransom or destroy evidence? Perhaps they were trying to lead him into a trap, but ignoring such a call would be unforgivable. In the morning, he contacted a colleague who was to keep him informed of where he would be and when he would return. If anything went wrong, she promised to raise the alarm. And yet, standing outside the decrepit wing of the Library of Congress, Julian felt his knees shaking with tension. It seemed to him that agents could be hiding around every corner, ready to grab him and take his documents. But he pulled himself together and went inside. The semi-darkness and the smell of antiquity enveloped him. Dusty shelves with rare books, high-vaulted ceilings and rare rays of light breaking through stained glass windows. The rustle of footsteps echoed under the vaults, creating an atmosphere of mystery. A woman was waiting for him behind one of the distant shelves. She looked to be in her early 30s, with a strict hairstyle and a formal suit. She introduced herself as Rachel Harper, said that she worked in the legal department of one of the international companies that figured in the investigation. "I don't mean to threaten you," she began, noticing the wariness in Harris's eyes. "But you have to understand the dangerous people behind these deals. You thought it was directly tied to the president, but it's much bigger than that." Trump may not even have known the full extent of the machinations that a group of influential people were pulling off. They're using his image, his relationships with foreign investors, but the end goal is more than just profit. There are high-ranking officials and politicians from several countries involved. All are involved to varying degrees in a highly complex scheme to launder money, redistribute assets, and influence legislation. Harris felt a tightness in his chest. It all sounded like a conspiracy theory of epic proportions, and yet it fit into the puzzle pieces he could see. Trump himself might be a piece in the game, albeit a powerful one, but not the mastermind. "Why are you telling me this?" he squeezed out with difficulty. Rachel looked at him sympathetically. "Because I know too much. And if I keep quiet now, sooner or later, I will be forced to do things that go against my conscience. These people will stop at nothing. The louder your investigation is, the less likely it is that we will all be quietly eliminated. Your public resonance is the only defense. I can give you even more materials, but you will have to disclose them as quickly and widely as possible. If you hesitate, they will get you. If everything comes out into the public space, they will have to act more carefully." She handed him a folder of papers and a small electronic key, similar to a keychain. She explained that even more serious data about the participants in the scheme was encrypted inside. Harris hesitated, but took the key anyway. "What are you risking by giving this away?" "Everything," Rachel answered quietly, "including my life. But I have no other choice." At that moment, echoing footsteps were heard somewhere in the depths of the library. Rachel gave a nervous start, nodded to Harris, and without waiting for a farewell, quickly disappeared into the labyrinth of shelves. The journalist was left standing in the semi-darkness, clutching in his hands the materials that might become the pinnacle of his investigation. Or his death sentence. When he stepped outside, the sun was blinding his eyes, and it seemed to him that dozens of eyes were watching him. The street noise, the tourists taking pictures of the beauty of the building, the students rushing to the entrance, all life went on as usual, and no one guessed what a dangerous game was going on right now behind the scenes of this everyday picture. Harris decided to immediately go to his loft and check everything once again for authenticity. He felt that he had almost no time left. If someone in the administration was planning to stop him, now was the best time. The road seemed endless to him. He kept looking around, expecting the mysterious pursuer to appear from around the corner. But by a lucky chance, he managed to get there without incident. But at the entrance to the building, he noticed a police car. The officer standing next to him glanced at him, but did not say a word. "Are they checking me? Or is this just a coincidence?" Julian thought as he passed. His heart was pounding in his chest, as if after a marathon. Inside the loft, he finally examined the contents of the folder. There were printouts of contracts signed by people from several countries with the obligation to provide a political support. In return, they mentioned very generous sums. In addition, there were photocopies of passports identifying the individuals involved in these agreements. Everything pointed to the fact that huge sums of money were being laundered through offshore structures, and the figure of the president was used as a facade to create the illusion of legitimacy. But the question remained as to how much Trump himself understood the scale of the game. Trying to reconcile this with what he had already learned, Harris felt a sudden wave of fear. If this were revealed, the consequences could be catastrophic not only for the president, but for the entire political system. Interstate relations would be shaken and the financial market could react chaotically. But to remain silent about it would be to become an accomplice, save the country's reputation by covering up the crimes, or risk it for the truth. Looking at the electronic key that Rachel had handed over, he remembered her words, "Your public resonance is the only defense." Indeed, if he released this into the media space now, an international scandal could occur, but at least all the participants would not be so easy to silence. And yet, a thought lingered in his soul. What if the documents were fabricated for other purposes, and he himself became a puppet in the hands of unknown puppeteers? Doubts, fear, thirst for truth and journalistic passion intertwined in him into a single ball, suffocating and forcing him to act. He did not know whom to believe, but he was sure of one thing. All this was important for society, and he had no right to remain silent. What decision would he make? When would the incriminating information appear in the news? And would he have time to make it public before people who could resort to extreme measures at any moment followed in his footsteps? He had never experienced anything like this before, and he understood. If he backed down now, his entire career, his entire reputation would go to hell. Not only the public would not forgive him, but he himself as well. All he could do was move forward, hoping that the truth would prevail over the secret intrigues of those in power. It seemed as if the whole city had sunk into a state of latent anxiety. Day after day, the media continued to relish the details of the conflict between Harris and the president. Some channels invited him for interviews, others poured mud, accusing him of all sins. But the real storm had not yet broken out. Harris was slow to publish the most sensational materials, trying to verify their authenticity. He understood that only by shooting for sure would he be able to avoid the complete destruction of his reputation. This was not just a search for the truth, it was a high-stakes game, where the loser would face total collapse. Rumors began to swirl through the corridors of the White House. Advisors and officials began to whisper about the possibility that some papers could lead to impeachment if the president's direct knowledge of corruption was confirmed. Signs of internal struggle began to appear. Some politicians tried to distance themselves from the possible scandal, while others stood up for Trump, dismissing it as a dirt throwing. But Julian could not be sure that the president himself was really aware of every detail. The world of politics is complex, and sometimes even the head of state can be just a pawn in the hands of more cunning players. One evening, as Harris was returning to his apartment, his editor called him. "Look, Julian, we can't play the waiting game anymore. The information space is heating up. Competitors with different versions of events are overtaking us. Many are already writing that we leaked the topic. We need to come out with the material before the public's interest fades. Make up your mind. Let's publish what we have." "Ante, Harris was silent for a long moment, looking out the window of his car at the city lights running past. He wanted to be 100% ready, but in such matters, there is no such thing as complete readiness. "Okay," he said finally, "tomorrow we'll release the first part. Not all the documents, but enough to show that this isn't fiction. Otherwise, people will stop believing us." He sensed that the decision could be a turning point. The next morning, a lengthy story by Harris and his colleagues appeared online in the newspaper. It laid out the facts, backed up by excerpts from bank records, emails, and meeting notes. The names of some of the participants were still hidden behind initials so as not to be easily identified, but the message was clear: a vast pattern of international dealings involving offshore companies that had once been owned or influenced by Trump. The story stressed the need for a thorough investigation and called on the public to demand transparency from the government. The reaction was staggering. The newspaper's website crashed under the influx of visitors. Social media was filled with links, and political talk shows quoted individual paragraphs from the publication from morning until night. The White House issued an immediate statement, calling the article a disinformation based on anonymous sources and unverified documents. Trump posted a scathing tweet: "Another lie from the corrupt media, no investigation because there was no crime." Fake news is at it again. But Harris had a few more tricks up his sleeve. He did not reveal all the materials at once, fearing that his opponents might have time to mitigate the consequences. Instead, he decided to release the revelations in portions so that society would have time to comprehend and absorb the information, and opponents would not have the opportunity to refute everything too quickly. Journalists dubbed this a dosed bomb, when fact after fact shoots out at the masses, creating a wave that only grows. In parallel with the public uproar, Harris continued to seek confirmation from technical experts. Analysis of the evidence took several more days, but indicated that there was no obvious sign of forgery. Even the encryption inside the electronic key received from Rachel revealed financial statements that matched real bank statements too closely to be a lie. Meanwhile, Rachel contacted him again, this time through a secure channel. She said that she was suspected of leaking information and that she would have to leave the country to avoid. But before leaving, she wanted to give Harris another batch of documents taken from the company computer. She believed that if the world knew the whole truth, the conspirators would have no chance of escaping justice. They arranged a meeting in the evening in an obscure park outside the city, under the pretext of a casual stroll. Harris arrived at the appointed place, but not to attract attention, and found Rachel standing near a bench under an old tree. She was wearing a dark raincoat, and her eyes were anxiously sliding around the surroundings. At the sight of the journalist, she sighed with relief, but immediately warned that there might be tales around. Having handed him a sealed envelope, she said only one thing: "This is the last data I managed to copy. There may be specific names of people from the president's political circle inside. Publish it as soon as possible. And I'm leaving." Before Julian could answer, Rachel turned around abruptly. Two strangers in suits emerged from behind the trees, their faces expressionless, their movements too confident. They seemed to be professional agents. Rachel tried to hide, but one of them was already walking towards her. Harris realized that it was dangerous to stay where he was, and decided to take a desperate step to pretend that he was just a passerby. At that moment, when the strangers came closer, he discreetly hid the envelope in the inside pocket of his jacket, turned around, and walked in the other direction. He was lucky that the agent's attention was riveted on Rachel. He himself chose not to look back, only heard quiet phrases sounding behind his back. "Come with us. We want to ask you a few questions." Everything inside him sank. He assumed that Rachel had been captured or was going to be interrogated. Julian left the park and hurried to his car. His hands were shaking, and the thought was pounding in his head: "I need to check what's in this envelope and make it public before they catch me." He dialed a colleague at the editorial office, briefly explained the situation, and arranged to meet in a secret room. The chances of Rachel escaping seemed slim, and this tormented his conscience. But the main duty of a journalist is not to let the information she risked her life to pass on be lost. When he finally opened the envelope, he saw that in addition to the text printouts, there was a flash drive. Its contents were staggering. Reports marked as strictly confidential. Minutes of meetings where the need for a favorable solution to issues for specific foreign companies was disgust. Moreover, among the documents there were logos and seals indicating approval at the level of high-ranking officials whose names were known to every American who followed politics. It was possible that Trump was aware of it and perhaps even personally gave some orders. But again, everything could be interpreted in different ways. There were no direct instructions of the president ordered anywhere. And yet, overall context was more than eloquent. Harris's team decided to publish the second wave of materials immediately. In special notes, the journalists indicated that, for security reasons, the names of some participants are still hidden. At the same time, they presented indisputable facts confirming the existence of large-scale corruption schemes. The material was immediately picked up by leading world publications, and literally within 24 hours, the public demanded a reaction. On Capitol Hill, they started talking about creating a special commission that would study the facts. Opposition congressmen called for an open investigation, and White House representatives continued to deny everything and threaten lawsuits. Rallies resumed in the streets, sometimes turning into clashes. Banza, Hyun Mi-yu longer cared how specifically Trump was guilty. People felt they were being deceived and wanted justice. Harris soon noticed that he began to be followed by other people's eyes and footsteps, feeling that he was being watched literally everywhere. In the parking lot at the editorial office, on the way home, at the supermarket. Sometimes it seemed to him that his phone was being tapped and his computer was being hacked. Colleagues convinced him to leave the city for a while, even the country, but he could not leave the battlefield at the most interesting stage. With each new day, the authorities found themselves in a more difficult position because journalists and activists, inspired by Harris's example, also began to release their own investigations, revealing more and more details of international corruption. The White House, for its part, threw some confusion into its public statements, claiming that the president was a victim of a conspiracy and that Harris was biased in her coverage to serve certain political interests. But public pressure eventually forced steps toward formally launching a Justice Department investigation. It seemed that the system that had so far faithfully protected the president could no longer ignore the noise and resonance. As the commission began to take shape, tensions continued to mount. And then what many had feared happened. In a live broadcast on a major news channel, Trump suddenly declared that he was ready to listen to the charges, but at the same time lashed out at the journalistic community, accusing it of inciting hatred and of betraying the national interest. He emphasized that a people will figure out for themselves who to believe, and hinted that certain forces were using Harris to weaken the president ahead of the upcoming election campaign. These words sounded like a declaration of war, and his body language indicated extreme irritation. Julian saw the speech live. He sensed that the president was turning the tables, portraying himself as the victim and Harris as a puppet of dark forces. But he couldn't sit back. The journalist knew that only by continuing to release documents explaining their connection to specific individuals and deals could he keep the public on his side. The following days were crucial. Central newspapers and TV channels launched a real battle of experts. Some experts claimed that the documents presented were 100% confirmed, while others said that they were manipulations and a combination of disparate facts. Skeptics asked why the president did not authorize a full audit of his former business structures if he had nothing to hide. Trump supporters appealed to the fact that he had already publicly distanced himself from personal involvement in commercial activities, but there could be no compromise. The division in society had reached colossal proportions. In some places, mass protests demanding the overthrow of the corrupt elite took place, while in other cities, rallies in support of the president appeared, where protesters loudly claimed that he was being subjected to groundless persecution. When the police had difficulty containing the clashes, sometimes leading to riots. A couple of weeks after the second wave of publications, something happened that made even staunch observers shudder. A video appeared in news feeds in which unknown people in masks and with altered voices declared that they were ready to publish even more explosive evidence, allegedly received from a high-ranking source. They claimed that they could show direct correspondence in which President Trump names the amounts of rewards for supporting the necessary decisions. But they put forward a condition. They promised to publish the materials if the authorities do not begin repression against honest journalists. It sounded like an ultimatum and a sign that Harris himself was not alone in his fight. However, there was a risk that the video was simply someone's provocation. The situation was becoming increasingly chaotic. With all this, Julian realized that he no longer controlled the information wave. It lived its own life, growing with rumors, hypotheses, and fakes. Even without new materials, people continued to retell scandalous facts, embellishing them or supplementing them with speculation. The Harris effect. This is what they began to call the phenomenon, in which one exposure drags along with it a whole bunch of unformed suspicions. For him, this was not just fame, but a heavy burden. He received threats, anonymous letters. He seriously feared that someone might decide to physically eliminate witnesses and the journalist himself, just to stop the avalanche of incriminating evidence. One evening, a figure wrapped in a dark coat appeared at his door. A neighbor on the landing told him that the figure had been standing there for at least an hour, making no attempt to enter or ring the doorbell. When Harris stepped out into the hallway, the stranger had vanished, but left a note with the strange words, "Come, decide who you are with." The text was handwritten, unsigned. What exactly the choice was remained a mystery, but Harris felt less and less safe in his own home. At the height of the tension, with talk of impeachment raging on the streets, the White House announced that the president would agree to a brief meeting with the journalist who had first stirred up the allegations, to show he has nothing to hide. It was a surprise. Many saw the invitation as a trap or an attempt to stage a grand show in which Trump, with his talent for public speaking, would expose the journalist. But Harris could not pass up the chance to interview the president and ask the very questions that had long troubled America. The interview was scheduled in the Oval Office. The atmosphere was tense to the extreme. Aides stood behind the president, and stern Secret Service agents stood at the door. Trump sat in his chair with his usual confident air. When Harris entered, the president nodded politely, but his eyes were set in steely determination. "Well, Mr. Harris," he began, clasping his fingers and smiling slightly, "you won't let up. I'm ready to listen to your questions. I hope you have more than just these far-fetched accusations." The journalist felt a slight tremor in his knees, but pulled himself together. Before him was not just a politician, but a man whose word could change the fate of the country. He understood that the outcome of the whole story now depended on his questions and the president's reaction. The first couple of minutes of the interview were formal. Harris raised the topic of offshore companies. Trump responded that this was normal business practice, especially when it came to international investment. When the conversation turned to specific transactions involved in the investigation, the president visibly tensed up, but continued to deny any illegal activity. Suddenly, Harris pulled out several copies of documents without disclosing all the details so that the president could not accuse him of forgery right there on the spot, and asked for a comment on the coincidences of dates, amounts, and administration decisions. Trump's face darkened. "This is absurd," he said. "My advisors and lawyers have checked all these issues many times. I have no direct relationship with these companies, nor do I monitor their operations. Any coincidences are speculation. The assertions that I gave instructions are laughable." But then something unexpected happened. One of the presidential advisors in the room made a subtle grimace, as if he were having an internal conflict. Harris noticed it, though Trump seemed oblivious. Then the advisor glanced quickly at the reporter, and there seemed to be a flicker of despair or remorse in his eyes. And then it dawned on Harris that someone inside the president's team might disagree with the official position and might at any moment come forward with new evidence, or confess. Fun. But the resolution would take time. As the interview drew to a close, Trump made a theatrical statement. "I think our viewers have seen that there is no sensation here," he said with a confident smile to the camera. Reporter Harris asked the questions. I gave the answers. There is no scandal. And all the fuss is just an attempt to disrupt my work for the benefit of the people. We are finished, Mr. Harris. The journalist left the White House feeling that the president had managed to maintain an image of quiet strength and steer the conversation to a more favorable position for himself. But the public could no longer be fooled by a single speech. The documents and facts that Harris had collected were too strong to be dismissed, and the Justice Department investigation was now official and could lead to serious conclusions. Everything depended on whether witnesses would be willing to testify under oath that the president or his associates were involved in these dubious transactions. A few days after the interview, America witnessed another shocking event. One of the president's key aides resigned. In his farewell statement, he hinted that his conscience does not allow him to continue serving in an environment where the truth is sacrificed for political interests. This gave rise to a flurry of speculation. Is he really ready to cooperate with the investigation, confirm or deny Harris's information? Finally, official hearings began in Washington. Congress summoned administration representatives, experts, journalists, and Harris himself became a key figure testifying under oath. There were many questions, and the process threatened to drag on. But one thing was clear: the country was facing a difficult period when the reputation of the highest authority and people's faith in the system of governance were at stake. Thus ended the main part of this incredible standoff. Although many aspects of the scandal would unfold for years, the public was divided. Trust in the institutions of power was shaken, and the role of journalists in modern democracies was once again in the spotlight. In fact, this story is far from over. It's only opened the door to deeper secrets hidden in the corridors of power. But if you've watched or read it to this point, it's important to remember the truth can be painful, risky, and inconvenient for powerful forces. However, without it, society stops developing, plunging into the darkness of manipulation. Journalists, risking everything, continue to ask uncomfortable questions, and it is these questions that prompt us to ask ourselves, how ready are we to seek the truth and defend it? Like this story if you are not indifferent to it. Each of your reactions raises the importance of the topic, and comments help us better understand what worries people. Subscribe to the channel to follow new investigations, because together we all shape public opinion and influence the future. Put a bell so as not to miss the next story that can change your understanding of politics and modern reality. And, most importantly, do not be afraid to ask and look for answers. This is how our world changes.